Welcome to the CSIS event, U.S. China Relations and the Future of America's Energy and Automotive Sectors. I have two excellent speakers joining me today, who I will be introducing in just a second. And we're very excited to have you in this event. Today is the afternoon of October the 24th in Washington, D.C. So keep in mind that we'll be discussing U.S. China relations, which have entered a particularly volatile phase at this moment, and things have been changing very rapidly. But we do hope that this will provide some very interesting insights into how to think about the path moving forward. China has emerged as this juggernaut in climate technology or clean tech or really electricity-based technologies that have become increasingly popular globally, whether we're talking about batteries, electric vehicles, grid technologies, solar panels. China's production and consumption of these technologies is really unparalleled globally. This is both good from a climate perspective. It is helping China move along the energy transition, China obviously being the largest emitter of carbon emissions globally. It's also creating new tensions from a trade perspective for China around the world and raising new questions over security, right? Both on the terms of data protection for smart technologies, but also the risks of overdependence on a single source for technologies that are becoming increasingly important for many countries' electricity grid. Most recently, new export controls that China has introduced on rare earths and also has announced on battery technology have raised a lot of concerns globally about China's really leading position and near monopoly in the production of some of these goods. So in all this context, we are now expecting a meeting between President Trump and President Xi Jinping next week in Korea. As I said, we'll see if things change, but for now, this meeting is still on. And there's been a lot of talk about whether this could lead to a deal or rather escalation and further tensions. Of course, the past year has had a lot of moments of ups and downs between the two countries, very high tariffs, export controls on both sides, reduced people-to-people exchanges. But at the same time, there's been talk about some sort of big agreement that might lead to an investment deal, reduction in tariffs. So there's a lot on the table right now. And I'm so pleased to have today with me two experts that have been thinking very deeply about this issue. We have Michael Davidson, who I'm proud to say is a senior associate and non-resident senior associate with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is an associate professor jointly with the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department and the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego, where he leads the Power Transformation Lab. And then we have Kate Logan, who is instead a DC-based expert, director of the China Climate Hub and Climate Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and also a fellow with the Asia Society's Policy Institute Center for China Analysis. And I, of course, am Ilaria Mazzocco, deputy director and senior fellow with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics here at CSIS. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Ilaria.
So let me just jump right into it. Michael, what are the dangers of collaborating and being dependent on China for these technologies?
Yeah, I think that there's been some various levels of concerns raised over the years, as you probably have all been tracking. I think there's actually quite a few to number, but I'll try to simplify it into what I think is probably the top three that come up. The first is that China has heavily concentrated supply chains in many of the key technologies, as well as the components that go into the technologies. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to wonk out about what those products and components are. And that represents very specific potential disruption risks, as we saw this year when China placed export controls on rare earth magnets, right? I think number two is this question around data security. Increasingly, some of these clean energy technologies have significant amounts of connected components. They have cameras, they have measuring, they collect data, they have software. These have raised various kinds of concerns, including resulting in a regulation promulgated by the Biden administration to effectively ban all Chinese EVs on the roads in the United States for these reasons. And then the third is a more national security, military, dual-use component where some of these Chinese firms have relationships or also supply Chinese military firms and contractors, and thus there is a sense there could be some dual-use components or indirectly benefiting Chinese military. So I think those are the three risks. I'm happy to get into what might we do to mitigate those risks, but I feel like if I had to summarize, we'd probably start with those three.
Great. And I think, we could also talk more broadly about how other countries are thinking about these risks, where I think the U.S. is probably, I would say, based on my research, there's a spectrum, and the U.S. is probably more on the, is more on the more concerned side of the spectrum, and other countries are placing themselves in other positions, and some of these issues are more risky for them or less risky. But I think perhaps a question for later on. Kate, why don't you tell us instead why we should be, what are the arguments in favor of more openness to Chinese clean tech, either collaboration or investment or whatever other form it might take?
Sure. So I'm glad I get a chance to push back against the risk-based framing, because I think there has been an asymmetric treatment of risks versus benefits, especially over the past couple of years. And maybe before I dive into that piece, we'll start just by saying, if you take a step back and thinking about, the current environment for clean energy overall in the U.S. is obviously not so great. Potential openness on the U.S. China front, but just, continued dependence only on fossil fuels perhaps presents the greatest risk overall versus actually investing in a way that accelerates the clean energy transition here in the U.S. So I think in terms of buckets of benefits, there are a couple that I'd point to. I think the foremost that should be pretty obvious to many who have been watching China's clean technology story is the technological piece. And I think we can wonk out later as well about the benefits of being able to leverage that for the U.S. advantage, especially in terms of technology transfer, licensing, ways that this can be done in practice. But if you think about the future of the U.S. big auto industry makers, how are they going to be able to make the transition if they can't leverage Chinese battery technologies that are low cost and high tech compared to the options that are available to them at present? Second piece that I'd emphasize is jobs and workforce development. This is something that our current president has also emphasized in some of his high-level talking points. But, I think this is something that, in terms of the local community benefits, there's a lot more to be done in terms of how investments can be set up such that they ensure local communities actually perceive the benefits of job creation in the long term, and that economic piece trickles down to the local level. Obviously, cost considerations in terms of being able to onshore some of this technological production, lowering costs. And then finally, if the U.S. energy demand continues increasing at the rate it has been, that's going to cause prices of utilities to go up, in terms of being able to leverage the cheapest way to achieve that energy demand going forward. Would also point to that as something that should incentivize the U.S. to figure out how to leverage some of the Chinese clean tech dominance for our own advantage. So would point to those pieces maybe to start.
Well, okay, let's pause right there. I think, there's two things that maybe would be helpful for people to better understand that I hope we can all think about a little bit. One is, what does this actually mean in practice, right? What does leveraging Chinese technology mean in practice? Does it mean BYD opening a car factory in the United States? Or does it mean, purchasing machinery from China? Or does it mean licensing technology that then American workers actually use and learn from? So I think that's one thing I'd like to talk about. And then the other thing maybe that would be useful to talk about is what is the Chinese advantage that has been so difficult to replicate outside of China? And I think, those are two different issues, but I think both are important for people to maybe think about, or for us to think about, since it's complicated issues.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in on the first question. So we actually recently attempted to map all of the different Chinese joint ventures and other investments in the U.S. that have cropped up since the Inflation Reduction Act aimed to incentivize greater investment in clean tech industries in the U.S. We found about, 14 or 15 joint ventures. This also includes things like the CATL Ford deal, which Ford frames as a partnership, given that it's more of a licensing agreement. But I think one of the key takeaways from that piece of research is that there's certainly no one-size-fits-all deal structure. They really run the gamut. And this was looking specifically at the solar and battery industries, just to sort of scope what we were looking at. So you see everything from what I mentioned on Ford CATL, which is licensing partnership, to, sort of almost like 4951 joint ventures, to a different structure where it's much smaller minority share joint ventures. I think, like the LONGi and Venergy deal, Illuminate USA, is particularly interesting because you have an off-taker partnering with the solar manufacturer to sort of guarantee some degree of demand for the products that are ultimately produced. But I think key point is that there's also varying degrees of local, acceptance of these deals as well. But it's really, like there's a lot of innovation and creativity in terms of how these deals can be structured. That said, I would be remiss if we don't bring up the foreign entity of concern requirements that have been enhanced or expanded with the recent reconciliation bill that passed in July. The Treasury Department has not yet released the guidance on how they'll be implemented in practice, but what these do is put much greater restrictions on Chinese material involvement in projects, and this will vastly narrow the scope of projects that can receive tax credits in those industries where the tax credits will continue, such as batteries, out to 2034 for solar, and when the tax credit runs out much sooner than that. So that's certainly a factor that will also prompt some of these companies to innovate even further going forward.
Yeah. And Michael, did you have anything to add to that?
No, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say, I thought, there's a question that raised that I think, jumping around a little bit here, but, the question that kind of keeps popping up in my mind and I've heard multiple times is, do Chinese firms even want to invest in the United States given this sort of level of uncertainty, right? They don't know if there's a foreign entity of concern regulation that might get changed again, right? And then they don't know necessarily how welcome they'll be by the local communities, because of course there has been a lot of pushback in some places. Of course, the Goshan case in Michigan is made a lot of headlines, and and it's just there have been other markets where Chinese firms have been much more welcome when they've invested. So what is your sense? Do we have a sense?
I think that the Chinese firms really want the U.S. market, right? I mean, we look at the Chinese domestic clean energy sectors, and they're all really hurting because it's a very intense competitive pressure. And their margins are very low at home, even despite their significantly advanced technology. So they like the export markets where they can get margins. In contrast to dumping, that's where they make actually a good profit margin, selling to Europe, selling to North America, et cetera. So they want those markets. And I think the Chinese government has, for the most part, encouraged going out, both exporting as well as investment abroad. This is, of course, countered with more recent efforts to flex, if not exercise, some of the geopolitical leverage that they have in terms of choke points on specific products. But I think all things being equal, the Chinese firms would like to be here, and the Chinese government would most likely let the Chinese firms be here, caveat, what specific technologies, et cetera. Whether the Chinese firms, over the last, say, year or two would really want to put down roots, now that's another question. I think the U.S. government has significantly harmed its own credibility for making significantly long-term investments into plants that would take several years to get payback. They have lifetimes exceeding a decade. If these FEOC rules change on a dime, that implicates them. If CFIUS change, if there's CFIUS implications, et cetera. But I do think there is opportunity. There is a scope for setting out what are some clear guardrails for Chinese involvement in some of these projects. And even with the bill that was passed that added significantly more constraints on credits, a variety of credits, I think there is still some scope to try to think about how to make that a little bit more flexible to encourage the types of deals that are best for U.S. firms and U.S. projects to move forward.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. I mean, I think a key reflection on the Madrid talks and the reporting that the Chinese side came into those talks with this, offer of potentially $1 trillion in Chinese investment in the U.S. That's certainly coming from some of the factors that you mentioned, Michael, in terms of the domestic market and the fact that these firms need the international markets to be able to achieve their revenue margins. So I think that in itself is one piece, but the way that we've been framing it is at the same time you have the policies getting ahead of the politics. So now you have this complex web of policies that are incredibly difficult to navigate and impose a cost in terms of firms, legal and other departments that need to figure out how they can actually structure a deal in practice. So what we've been sort of perceiving is that perhaps it's those firms that already have a foothold in the U.S. that will be able to navigate some of those restrictions, but perhaps that will squeeze out some of the other firms that are trying to compete within these sectors on the China side, and just emphasizing as well that these are mostly private firms. They're not state-owned enterprises, so that also shapes how this plays out in practice.
I mean, to be clear, there's Chinese effectively put a pause on new greenfield investments as a result of these trade disputes. So we're still waiting for some clarity and resolution on that. And I think hitting $1 trillion in greenfield is going to be hard.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
I think I agree with that. And also, to be honest, even the executive orders that this administration has put out has essentially sort of, I would say, is maybe not vetoed, but certainly is discouraging Chinese investment in most sectors, right? So it's actually sort of hard to envision, new investment without the executive orders just being completely overturned. So I think that's worth noting. But I will say, I agree. I think I broadly agree with what you said, Michael. I think Chinese firms do benefit a lot from engaging, investing, and exporting to developed markets, right? I think that's generally been a pathway for upgrading and innovation, and they've seen a lot of benefits to that. So I think now, as some of these companies have been diversifying more towards emerging markets, there's sort of a question mark as to whether they can really replace that sort of, that function that exports to Europe, the United States, or other sort of wealthier countries serve, because obviously the products are a little more affordable. They're probably less cutting edge in some cases. In some cases, not all, but. So I think that's sort of big question mark there for Chinese firms, and that would be a big advantage. I will note that ultimately in many cases we are talking about the same firms that are investing elsewhere, and I've been tracking them a lot in other countries like emerging markets, and you do wonder whether some of them are stretched a little thin, right? You look at companies like CATL or BYD, and they are opening a lot of factories, right? So I think there's a bit of a question of how many factories can they open, and would it be worth it for them to open in the United States? Maybe, if Xi Jinping tells them to, then it's actually worth it for them. But it might require significant sort of incentives on both sides.
Yeah, and actually just to jump in on that, Alara, I'd be curious to hear a little bit more from you on how has the EU been approaching some of these same questions? Because again, there's reporting recently that they're also considering some sort of mandated technology transfer. So just curious in your research, if you have any insights on that piece.
Yeah, I think in a way that's probably not atypical for the European Union. The debates have gone on for a very long time, and meanwhile, things have changed, right? So the investments have happened, largely speaking, right? I think some of the biggest players, and we're mostly talking about the automotive sector when it comes to Europe, right? Battery and EVs. Some of the biggest players have already opened factories in Europe, right? Or they're building them. So BYD, CATL, right, Goshan, right? These companies already have a presence in Europe, so it's unlikely to me that they are going to open significant new investments, right? There may be some other companies that could still make, there's a few auto companies that might make them, but Chery has announced a joint venture, right? You start going through it. Geely already had a big presence because of Volvo, right? You start going through the names, and it starts looking like the big top players have already made those investments. So the idea that the negotiation can be made linked to access to Europe doesn't really hold. So now it's much more of a question of what the EU or member states can do ex post and say, well, we gave you these incentives, therefore, we expect a certain level of localization, or, if we're going to investigate you for, some not necessarily according to the law and all that, right? But there may be investigations that are linked to subsidy use, et cetera, that might come online, right? So I think there's that, but that's really where I think things are going to be shifting in Europe. I suspect that a lot of the big investments already happened. So it's in a very different position compared to where the United States is. And in so many ways, the leverage has already been lost. So I think that's going to be the question moving forward. I will say the other interesting thing about Europe is that some of the big automotive companies are much more integrated or comfortable with their dependence on Chinese value chains. And so even companies like Stellantis that don't necessarily, they're not some of the biggest players in China or don't rely as much on sales in China. They have partnerships with Leapmotor to bring some of these new EVs and platforms to Europe. So I think they are sort of thinking very much about how they can leverage that Chinese technology in not just the Chinese market, but abroad as well. Obviously, this would look very difficult for U.S. automakers to do, if not for anything else, for the connected vehicle rule. But I think also for a variety of other political issues. So I think Europe is very interesting for the U.S. to look at, but also in a very different position. Yeah.
So was the U.S. Correct in exercising leverage before we had a single BYD on the streets? Is that? I felt like it was a cart before the horse, and we're nowhere near Japan level 1980s that would prompt such a severe trade reaction. But that's essentially what we have. But now the question is, if we open up the gates, will they come in?
Oh, I think they'd come in. I think.
You think?
I think if we opened, all the gates, I think
for investment. Sorry.
Oh no,
not
for I think for trade, yes, they would definitely come in. I think in terms of investment, that's a valid question. I mean, again, BYD is a company now that has a lot of new factories that it is building. But I think in the U.S. it would have to be a political choice. I think ultimately, I don't think this would be a purely commercial choice. I also think. In an odd, weird way, the United States would have a lot of that leverage, I think, because it is such a big market and it has had so many restrictions. But I don't think the U.S. introduced those restrictions to gain leverage to acquire investment, right? So I think very different compared to some other markets. If you look at like Indonesia or Thailand, they explicitly introduce tariffs in order to then remove them if a company invested in the country, right? This is certainly not what the United States has done. So I think
that's not what the previous administration did when they put in place the tariffs, but that certainly seems like that's the modus operandi of the current administration.
It might be. We'll see. I mean, I don't know. I think the real question is, and this is actually was going to be one of my next questions, is whether or not we'd get a deal with investment. But I think to me the question is what industries would they prioritize? What industries would this administration want Chinese investment in? And I don't have a clear answer, but maybe you guys do.
Where the U.S. administration would prioritize investment? Oh man, that's a good question.
I mean, I do know if it's like if we're talking about billions and billions of dollars, then it could go anywhere. But like, just say let's say that there's a deal and then it's negotiated and certain sectors are identified as priorities.
Yeah, challenging question. I mean, can speak a little bit from where I sit on the clean energy technology side. Obviously, there's solar, which I don't think is necessarily a priority of the current administration. I think, just on that piece, to add an aside, I think maybe the approach, given that the tax credits will run out relatively soon, is that Chinese solar panels have become so cheap that maybe it's actually economical to be able to import them again, and that's just how that plays out in practice. I would point to the battery sector as the one that I would be watching the most in terms of the clean tech spectrum. As you said, I don't think the EV sector is something that necessarily might open up, but would be interesting to see what happens in that regard. But I think the battery sector is something that has, broad base of applications. The question is, how do you sort of manage, the varying uses of batteries that run the gamut from clean energy applications to more security-minded applications. I think one piece that's interesting to see in the recent export controls from the China side is where they put the threshold of battery density, and we've been trying to understand, from a China perspective, where is China trying to draw the line in terms of what it shares with other economies in terms of its technology? And our understanding so far is that that right now wouldn't preclude most technologies that are needed for decarbonization in terms of grid batteries or electric vehicles. And it's really you need a Batman-style car or something for the battery threshold to actually be exceeded based on the current regulations. So it's interesting to see also just from the China perspective how they're sort of regulating their willingness to transfer technology. But yeah, I guess that would be the sector I'd have my eye on. Of course, there are other sectors you could point to like hydrogen electrolyzers or others. But yeah, curious if you have any thoughts, Michael.
So no BYD Batmans coming in the future. Yes, I guess I would think about the other side of this, which was what kinds of of guardrails and what kinds of conditions would need to be placed on such a deal to make it palatable in the current U.S. environment. We just put out a report with Third Way on how you would think about mitigating risks of Chinese projects in the United States, particularly those that would be eligible for federal funding, as well as how you maximize advantage. And in that context, in terms of mitigating risks, I think we would have to have a pretty clear conversation about how the flexibility of these FEOC rules and the material assistance rules would need to be potentially revised. Now, these are there are explicit thresholds listed in the Big Beautiful Bill, but the implementing regulations for many of those have not been put out, and there's still a lot of gray area about how you would exactly implement those, as well as the safe harbor rules. Mm-hmm. So there's potential scope for that to come out in the context of a deal, to allow for investments and projects that would require some inputs from China that are not critical, but they are important from, say, a values, like an overall value term. I think the other part, which would probably be very important and is very relevant to sort of the current issue, is diversifying some upstream minerals and products, right? So what we saw with the rare earth magnets is this is a clear issue where China does have leverage, and the U.S. government likely ignored the potential for China to exercise that leverage. Are there other such areas that would need to be considered? But really thinking about how you would graduate it, not necessarily putting everything that comes from China under the same bucket, but there are probably a good amount of materials and inputs that do not represent significant supply chain disruption risk or security risks, but figuring out clearly for those sectors that want to be targeted, are those and what kinds of supply chain contracting arrangements could be made to diversify the upstream suppliers. And then I fully agree with Kate that there's a lot of opportunities to maximize the benefits from community agreements and community benefits agreements, jobs, et cetera. What I would like to see is investment in the sectors where China is leading, not just money for money's sake. And that generates two advantages. One is obviously, you get investment in areas that are, that are higher end, that could build on, more competitive advantages in those particular sectors. But you also get potential spillover benefits. And I think so. If I were to look for a criteria of what the kinds of sectors should be targeted, it should be those that you would have very clear potential spillover, not just to that particular tech, and even if it's not, Batman level tech, even if it's the previous generation of tech, can you still get positive external spillovers to other sectors where the U.S. in the future could be an honest to goodness globally competitive supplier vis-a-vis China?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I struggle a lot with this question, right? Because I think I struggle to think of a technological area where China is in a position of advantage, where first of all, where China is unambiguously in a position of advantage, and then secondly, where there aren't massive, unmitigatable sort of security risks, right? And I think I think a lot of clean tech falls into that space where you can still think of some mitigating factors, and maybe not for everything, but and China is sort of unambiguously in a very strong position where there could be some interesting technology that the United States could acquire, or know-how, right? I think a lot of the challenge with this is really, and we didn't get to the point of why China is so good at this, is that a lot of it comes from the manufacturing, right? So it's a lot of tacit knowledge, and that's really hard to transfer, right? That's sort of hard to engineer the transferring of it. You don't transfer it for a contract and IP. And so I think this is an area where it would make sense to come up with some sort of strategy, and yet it's not necessarily a priority under the current administration. And at the same time, I think increasingly I question what kind of arrangement would we need to reach in order to get that sort of transfer into positive spillovers to U.S. industry, right? How do we enable sort of an innovation ecosystem in the United States, a manufacturing ecosystem that can help the United States sort of lead in the next generation technologies that are necessary, and how can you leverage Chinese investment? I'm sure it's doable, but I think there's probably a lot more work that needs to be done into thinking it through. That's just like
I might jump in. So I think just in terms of maximizing U.S. advantage, I feel like you could think about ownership structures of these. And so Kate mentioned Luminant USA, where the U.S. partner completely owns the land, the facilities. There are states where their Chinese entities are legally prohibited from owning land. And so you could structure deals to satisfy state rules and regulations. Or you can go a technology licensing route where the Chinese did not own any equity stake in the partnership. I think the second, more on the sort of the hard knowledge, IP management, making sure that you have clear rules about where IP that's generated through this project sits, who owns it, et cetera, and maximizing the U.S. localization of the IP. But honestly, on the tacit knowledge, I am less concerned about how easy that is, how hard that might be. I feel like if you have plants down the road and there's Chinese tacit knowledge, maybe Chinese engineers training some U.S. engineers on how to do it, that's going to spill over. Why do I know that? Because that's how China does it, right? China spills over. That's how China develops these amazing ecosystems, is because if you go work at this plant and then you leave it and you go work at a downstream plant, you know how the upstream plant works and you become more efficient. And then you have all these suppliers built up around each other. You get spillovers from major entrants when Tesla goes in, and the spillovers to other brands. And there's a variety of mechanisms that just happens naturally when you have that kind of engagement. It does not happen if you don't have the engagement.
Yeah, and I would also point to the recent Hyundai immigration raids as sort of waking up the current administration, the fact that you do need to have some degree of foreign workers to start that process. I think I've heard examples of other Chinese partial ownership companies that currently train some of their workers for U.S. facilities in China because that's more economical and efficient at this point. But ideally, we'd have that training happen here on U.S. soil, and then we'd be able to have the spillover effects that you mentioned.
Well, interesting. I mean, I think all things to keep in mind, right? That certainly we should be, if there ever is more investment. But I think, Kate, you may have pointed in the right direction that we probably should be keeping track of those companies that already have a footprint in the United States as those that are most likely to sort of stay and contribute to the current environment. I think my next question is actually, do you think there will be a deal next week? Do you think it will be good news or bad news for the U.S. energy auto industries?
I think this administration likes to make deals, but the China deal is the hardest deal of them all, so it takes a while to structure it. So I don't know if it's happening next week, but we've also seen from the rare earth magnet case that when there is obvious leverage, that you can come to the table and start to make some arrangements and get things flowing again. I'm saying that maybe as next week as an offering, Secretary Besson can bring a suitcase full of soybeans for the Chinese counterpart, and the Chinese can bring a suitcase of magnets, and we can start move forward on coming up with some arrangement that helps diffuse tensions and creating some more win-win opportunities.
I think maybe just to build on that, I think do both sides want a deal? I think the answer is probably yes. Is there interest on both sides that could potentially align? The answer is probably yes. Do both sides understand each other and how the other side operates at this point? It would point to the recent example of the tit for tat with the export controls, the BIS 50% rule, whatnot, is probably not quite there yet. So, I think the interest in terms of having some sort of deal eventually are there. Are we going to see immediate progress in the near term? Temper expectations, but what steps could be useful in the near term to actually move us in that direction is the question that I'd asked.
Yeah, I think it's entirely possible we, that we get a renewed truce next week, and then that leaves space for more conversations. But I think I think if there is some sort of investment package, it would be complicated, right? I mean, I think there are a lot of players, a lot of foreign companies that invested in the United States during the Inflation Reduction Act that were counting on protection from Chinese competition, right?
Well, not just foreign, but U.S. makers too, right?
Exactly.
And I think, we're talking about automotive. The automotive sector is not a monolith.
Yes.
You have very different strategies pursued by the big majors, either making arrangement for licensing with CATL, a major player, or trying to completely remove China from your supply chains and working with some of these other players. And then you also have the foreign companies that already have plants in the United States and operations, building on those to try to qualify for some of the now deceased clean electricity tax credits. I think one interesting, and I'm not sure if this is ironic, but certainly an unintended consequence is if you get rid of the tax credits that have high conditionality on local content, that effectively levels the playing field for the plants that are, the projects that are out there. So we're certainly most likely, as a result of this, going to see a reduction in appetite for bringing on new EVs models into these production lines, a shift certainly to plug-in hybrids, but also probably an overall secular decline in all plug-in because of the reduction in the credits. But you'll also, because you lack this protection, the firms that are going to have more flexibility in acquiring their components and supply chains, setting up their supply chains and whatever makes sense from a cost perspective, will probably involve more Chinese components in them. The only question mark there is tariffs, right?
Tariffs and, well, the connected vehicle rule for those components that are covered by that.
Yeah, the connected vehicle rule, as it currently stands, does not cover battery management systems.
Yeah.
It does not cover the important components that where you see a huge Chinese value. It, of course, cover a fully assembled Chinese vehicle arriving in Long Beach. But for battery components, now that's another issue, right? They could choose to revisit the connected vehicle regulation and apply that more broadly. I think that would be a big mistake because I think the connected vehicle concerns can be addressed without resulting in an outright ban. But without those kinds of very generous and explicit local content obligations in incentives, what's probably going to happen is you're going to see some more embrace of Chinese products and supply chains.
Yeah, and I also just asked the question again, going back to the point I made earlier about policies going ahead of the politics. Where is there still room to shape policies that are open? Is there anything that might be reversed as part of some high-level political opening? And also, what do the clean tech companies actually want and need? So have heard, within the clean tech industries now, this FEOC compliance has become sort of a buzzword in terms of how they're positioning themselves. What are the pieces that clean tech firms need to see to actually succeed? So things like battery industry, where we're still largely dependent on Chinese machinery to actually manufacture batteries, regardless of like the other pieces of that. How can we ensure that those pieces are still integrated into like some sort of broader scheme?
Let me ask you sort of a bonus question, which you may or may not have thoughts on. But Chinese companies are, I think, becoming more diversified as a result of various dynamics, right? Trade diversion in some cases, or industrial policy by other countries that have been attracting investment, right? So you just see more factories elsewhere. And at the same time, some of the trade deals we've seen this year that the Trump administration has negotiated with other countries seem to contain components of it or clauses that have to do with Chinese investment. And certainly I think in the USMCA renegotiation, Chinese investment is going to play a big role, especially obviously for Mexico. So I think how does this play out more broadly, right? At the same time, China is becoming more globalized. And the rest of the world is becoming in some ways more linked to Chinese value chains for a lot of technologies, not just these that we're talking about today, but certainly EVs, batteries, solar panels. And at the same time, there's this sort of impulse to sort of get the full DNA of what you're importing into the United States, right? How does this play out? What does this mean? Is this going to be the continuing trend? Are we going to see more pressure on places like the European Union, which has welcomed a lot of Chinese investment recently? Or does this just become, is this just unenforceable?
I mean, I think it's really difficult to enforce. I think one of the implications of the recent FEOC rules being tightened is this question of what happens to facilities in third markets in terms of FEOC compliant. Do they sort of, shape shift in order to be compliant with these regulations, or do they just veer toward other international markets in terms of their strategy and where they're selling? So I think it's extremely difficult to enforce any sort of like traceability when you get to a certain extent, like down the line. So how third countries navigate these pieces It still remains to be seen, but I think a lot of them are also trying to balance their interests so far. I don't know if you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a complicated set of both regulations and assessments as well as procedures that are going to be into the mix here. And so I think you were alluding to the transshipment problem, where Chinese firms set up shop in other countries and they import, say, mostly assembled products, stamp another country's origin label on it and ship it to the United States. I think that certainly what we've seen in the trade, I don't know if the trade deals, but certainly the announced trade intentions with a variety of countries have included such clauses, have included concerns, setting tariffs of, this country gets this tariff, but if it's transshipment from China, then you get the China tariff. I think exactly where you set that threshold, that there is some complicated regulations around those kinds of concerns. I think making that clear about, is it a value? Is it, a substantial transformation? Those kinds of things I think is really important to clarify for partners, trading partners that the U.S. is trying to make deals with outside of China. I do think that there is a bigger issue, which is that, before the current round of trade war, we've seen a number of MNCs moving outside of China to try to develop, their supply chains in other countries, essentially at the urging of the U.S. government. But instead, when they build up shop there, now they're slapped with very high tariffs. Now, not as high as China, but it's going to be an almost impossible game to numerically set a tariff at one country relative to the China tariff, such that you just go over the edge and encourage, competitive, efficient, suppliers in the country that you want to import products from more than you would from China. I think that's an impossible task, mostly because the Chinese are innovating more rapidly than any other country. So I think when you set the terms, you are going to face some challenges in how you reset and revisit those in the future, and that of course creates a huge problems for long-term investments from the business community. Yeah.
And I just layer one other element on top of this is what happens if you have a supply chain that's located completely outside of China, but China invested. How does that look from a security perspective to the U.S.? Is that acceptable in terms of compliance, whatnot, and what the current administration is looking for in some of these asks? I think that sort of remains to be seen, or is still an open question.
Yeah, I would say that I think as with some of the other risks, it's important to disambiguate. What are you trying to solve, right? What is the exact risk, and what is the appropriate policy recourse that doesn't unnecessarily harm your own interest by reducing the benefits, hurting consumers and hurting producers in the United States? I think that if you look, while yes, supply chain sourcing is quite complicated, but Chinese firms have shown their willingness to be very accommodating, I think, to specific U.S. regulations. And so the example, one example, of course, is Illuminate USA, where in order to avoid any concerns around their upstream sourcing, they decided to contract a non-Chinese polysilicon producer to supply this plant, a UK-based firm. These kinds of decisions can fully mitigate that, some subset of the supply chain sourcing risk. Now, but you can't enforce that across the whole supply chain for all of the components. I think so. You have to come up with some rules of, is this based on a gross value? Is it based on some very specific materials and minerals where we perceive that Chinese to have a huge bottleneck risk, and that if they exercise leverage like they did with magnets, that could generate some unacceptable impacts on the U.S. economy. I would argue for the latter, for a more targeted approach, recognizing in these firms where there is going to be investment, are there some critical materials and minerals that could generate some systemic risk, and making sure that you have some requirements and conditions in place that there is a diversification of those upstream minerals and materials.
And I think that's a really important point in terms of what is the linkage between end state manufacturing and these material input questions that we've been discussing, because they're two different pieces. They're obviously interrelated, but the example you raised in terms of being able to structure a deal more so on the manufacturing side, such that you leverage that to help accelerate more security from a material input perspective, but not at the cost of something like prohibitive local content requirements or other structures that essentially mean that it's not actually possible to source the material inputs that don't necessarily necessarily yet exist if those supply chains have not been, sort of like shifted or located outside of China or in a way that isn't exposed to some of the Chinese export controls. So I think that's an interesting example and piece to raise.
Yeah, and I think, it's absolutely correct to say that there are some areas that are where the risk is probably not mitigatable, right? Like the fact that China holds such an advantage in magnets and rare earths, and we already have evidence that it could weaponize this, means that that you just need a diversification strategy, right? That this is that's the way to go.
That was actually
And,
a question I had for both of you, given that you've been looking at some of the risks, is that do you feel like there's any risks that really can't be mitigated? Like you have solutions from a technical perspective to so many of these risks, and I appreciate that you laid them out really clearly in the recent paper that you put out, but was just curious if there's anything that you point to as this is something that there isn't necessarily a solution out there.
Well, I think the where you have those very specific critical material inputs and say sort of upstream products like magnets, it's quite clear that China could exercise leverage. I think the useful exercise, which I hope some people are doing, is okay. Let's game that out. If China does exercise leverage, if they exercise too much leverage, it backfires because then they lose their leverage over time. And this is exactly what happened with rare earths in Japan, over a decade ago. But if they exercise a little bit, then they can kind of flex their muscle. On the other hand, it's also important for the United States not to have too much hubris when we go into the negotiations and recognize when China does have some degree of leverage. And if there is a deal, there are things that we have that they want. There are things that they have that we want. That's what you can negotiate on. Even in the back, you're trying to think about how do we stand up more diversified supply chains. I think what we saw with the outlay of the IRA was that some of the requirements on local content on minerals were just unachievable for the vast majority of models on the market, and that was not the purpose of it, right? The purpose is to encourage onshoring, not to completely hamstring all potential or most potential models that were in the market. But having some flexibility at the front, but making a very clear long-term bet that there's going to be some diversification and onshoring. And so I think probably two components on that would be how serious are we with trying to develop, minerals extraction, processing, and some of these more, critical products like rare earth magnets here in the United States, and for what sectors are we trying to achieve them? I don't think that it's the Defense Department or others should be in the business of trying to ensure material supplies to the commercial auto sector. It's well beyond the scope, and it would require way too much funds. But if there are very specific sectors and products where we need these components, then I think there is a role for having a more secure, supply chain that does not have China components. But for the rest of the market, I think the strategy has to be diversification. China's going to be in the global mix. We want to reduce the share of China in that global mix. If for those areas where we think that there is key disruption risks, how do we encourage enough of that outside of China, but not necessarily in the United States, potentially with some U.S. firm involvement, but with other countries' involvement that would allow a recourse if China did decide to exercise that leverage again.
Yeah, and so actually, in some there is, I think, always conflict, and I think you're right, Michael, that you can have multiple goals, and you have to identify which goal you want to actually prioritize, right? And there's always some conflict between sort of the impulse to reshore everything and maximize U.S. jobs versus maybe ensuring a more achievable path to secure value chains, which might mean broader diversification globally, right? I think ultimately, when it comes to rare earths, it'd be, certainly if the U.S. were making a significant amount of refined rare earths, mining them, refining them, creating magnets, right? All that would be great. But I think it would already be, much of the world would be in a much less vulnerable position if there was just more sources more globally, right? Even if it weren't in an allied country, but just other countries that you could buy from in a moment of crisis. Just like, China can buy soybeans from Brazil when it decides not to buy them from the United States, right? It would be great for the United States to be able to buy rare earths from places outside of China. This has been an issue, I think, for many, many years, but hopefully this crisis is actually, pushes the momentum forward to actually find alternative sources, which would be important from, not just clean tech, obviously, there's multiple applications there. So I think, to me, these sort of bottlenecks are really where the security risk is just unmitigatable, right? I think there's obviously on the data security side and software side, and Michael and I were just talking about this earlier, I think there's obviously threats and concerns, but I think there's, it's much more of a degree of like, how much can you find alternative platforms, alternative software, data localization, right? There's technical solutions which may not be like all or nothing, that would certainly be worth exploring that might actually have a lot of economic benefits for the United States. But I think, it gets complicated, depends on the technology, right? But I think getting more granular, right? Is it the inverter? Is it the solar panel? Is it, which part of the connected vehicle are you concerned mostly about, et cetera? I think would be helpful in some of these cases. So I think that's, one lesson is you need to actually know the value chains really well, and you need to know the technologies really well, right? Which is always a challenge for everybody, especially policy people like me, always learning about this.
Don't sell yourself short.
Well, it's it does, but these are very cutting edge technologies, right? And I think that's a challenge for those making policy.
I think one of the takeaways I took from what you just said is that, most of the security risks actually do have concrete solutions, except for, like some of the areas that we discussed that are more challenging. But maybe to borrow a term from China's lingo, could you adopt sort of a dual track, dual circulation strategy where you're both continuing to source from China, but also building up alternative sources at the same time? And obviously it takes time to build out different material inputs. So I guess that's sort of the question I'd ask, but
You heard it here first, U.S. dual circulation.
Well, thinking of, the reverse tech transfer, we're taking a lot of pages out of China's playbook if you look at the broader spectrum, I guess. But the point I'd emphasize again is just going back to the risks versus benefits framing. I do urge a greater symmetry in terms of looking at the broader benefits in relation to the risk, given that you have raised pretty detailed, concrete solutions to so many of them.
I think ultimately it's also about what U.S. companies need, right? And so identifying what inputs are necessary. And I think this happens across a lot of technologies and a lot of goods, right? Where there are, along the value chain at some point, there's often something that you end up getting from China. And identifying what is it that's really helpful for those U.S. firms, and can you diversify it? No, maybe not. Then does it need to come from China? Then how do you actually sort of leverage that in a positive way for the United States? I think thinking about it that way is also quite good, right? And I think when you look at batteries, despite the tariffs, the U.S. still imports a lot of batteries from China, right? I think that's sort of an indicator that there may be something there, even though I think we're still a ways, and I think probably would not even be advisable to sort of just welcome with open arms greenfield investment from CATL in the United States, right? But I think there's still a dependency there. So thinking more strategically about how can you sort of maximize that production in the United States? Does it require some component from China, which, as you said, could be the machinery, right? Or is are we on a trajectory where we can solve that in the long term, right? Is there leapfrogging? Well, what does that leapfrogging require, right? Do you need to build out the manufacturing sector more? Do you need more financing, right? I think thinking through all the pieces that are necessary for these different pathways is probably helpful.
On batteries, I would say that I think that first, we haven't fully seen the effects of the battery tariffs. The Biden administration just put those out last year, together with 100% EV tariff. We don't know the full effects.
Well, we've had other tariffs this year.
Exactly. We don't know the full effects of the ones last year, and we certainly don't know the full effects of the ones that took place this year. And I was talking to someone who knows quite a bit about development in this space in Texas, and they were saying maybe we don't see those impacts until 2028. Getting to Kate's point that we have energy demand growth, we're going to have some both cost pressure, affordability, as well as potential resource adequacy issues in the electric power grid. That if we are really hamstringing our ability to deploy the cheapest way to meet that demand, which in many cases might be solar batteries and some degree of demand response, that's going to hurt a lot of ordinary consumers, a lot of utilities. It doesn't matter what state you're in. I think that would prompt some realignment around this sort of the import side of the question, the sort of the traded value, et cetera. On the leapfrogging, I would just say that China, the U.S. certainly has the potential to develop very cutting edge, new technologies in the energy sector and in other sectors where there are not already well-established Chinese supply chains. But we would be shooting ourselves in the foot if we didn't try to learn the best way that China is deploying tech that may be produced in similar ways. Let's try to learn as much as we can rather than shutting them out. That does not mean that losing advantage in those new emerging areas, because China's going to move in those areas regardless, right? It's not like China doesn't know that there is another chemistry out there besides lithium, and that they aren't already investing billions of dollars to try to explore those new chemistries. But because there are not already well-established supply chains, et cetera, that could be something if the U.S. had sort of recalibrated a little bit its openness to try to engage with Chinese through different mechanisms that we talked about today.
I think if we think about it from a power sector perspective, and I appreciate that we have a power sector expert at the table as well, if you think about renewable energy and life cycle, the fact that once you install renewable energy, it's on the grid for a while, it's more secure, but then there is a point at which it has to be replaced. And maybe part of the thinking around this is, what is the end goal in terms of the point at which you will have a mass replacement of a lot of these technologies that are being installed today? And at that point, how can the U.S. set itself up such that we can advantage ourselves from an economic perspective when those replacements and life cycles start to become something that can drive economic benefits?
Well, I think, we still identified a lot of challenges. I think, we still highlighted a lot of risks, right? I think, just the rare earths issue has not been resolved today by us, but I think we also discussed added a lot of nuance and unpacked a lot of the different challenges. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this will be an ongoing conversation. I know that both of you are doing work on this and have been publishing on this and speaking on this. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at your work. I think, we will certainly at CSIS still be tracking these issues. And I think next week we'll maybe also have more answers, perhaps, on some of the direction of all this is taking. But I think this also is not an issue that's going to be going away anytime soon, right? I think this question, if you look globally at the expansion of Chinese companies in these sectors and the expansion of Chinese trade, it just points to the fact that much of the world is going to be adopting a lot of these technologies. And so the United States should be thinking about its own strategy vis-a-vis this, whether it is more, U.S. indigenous innovation or, it is some sort of leveraging some sort of shape or form of some Chinese technology, or maybe more partnerships with other companies from other countries that may have promising technologies. I think this is definitely going to continue to be an issue that we'll be talking about for the next few years. So thank you so much, Kate and Michael, for joining me. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And have a good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are.